Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we are wrapping up our look at the epic saga of Koda no Kyoukai, or the Garden of Sinners series. We have seen all of the original series of movies, and so this is our kind of wrap-up episode of where we're looking at three different things. We're looking at the epilogue of the original series, the 30-minute epilogue that came out, I believe in 2010 as part of the Blu-ray release of the final movie. And then we're looking at the 2013 adaptations of Future Gospel, which is the movie, the 90-minute movie, which is an adaptation of 2 additional chapters Nasu wrote, and then Extra Chorus, which is an adaptation of 3 manga spin-off chapters that Takashi Takeuchi wrote in 2008 as part of the Future Gospel project. So these are the final animated pieces of Garden of Sinners. All of them are on Crunchyroll, luckily, so it's easy to get all of these. And we're kind of wrapping up our look at Garden of Sinners before we transition into the Fate section of the ufotable Moonworks.
And one note I will just make, because it was confusing me, in English, Future Gospel, the 8th and final movie, is usually called Recalled Out Summer now.
Yes.
For whatever reason. The Mirai Fukuin, which is the literal translation Future Gospel, at some point they added on the English Recalled Out Summer, and that is what it is called on Crunchyroll and elsewhere. So if you're confused, where's Future Gospel or where's Recalled Out Summer in this episode, they're the same thing. And then yes. Extra Chorus is also called either Future Gospel or Recalled Out Summer, blah, blah, blah. They're the same thing. It's a little confusing.
Yes, all the English titles are weird because it's like either you're getting different translations of the Japanese titles or you're getting these like English catchphrases that Nasu liked to put. That's what Recalled Out Summer comes from, is like this funny English language catchphrase he would put in the chapter or whatever. Like Garden of Sinners itself, that title is like this weird English expression that Nasu had presumably just thought, well, that sounds fucking cool, and threw that in there, and that became the English language title of the series. But yes, so that's where the title stuff is all weird, but yes, Recalled Out Summer and Future Gospel are the same thing.
I think this is a good batch of things, too.
Yes.
I think the epilogue is fantastic and thought-provoking, and maybe the most visually striking thing in any of the Koda no Kyoukai content. I think Future Gospel is a fantastic movie. It's a bundle of fun. It's, which, you know, it has some heavy themes, but mostly, like, it is just a really good time with these characters, and I really, really enjoyed it. And then I think Extra Chorus is slight, and I think it's a mixed bag, but there's some good stuff in it.
Yeah, Extra Chorus is definitely, like, you feel the nature of it being a Blu-ray extra,
yes.
Right? Like, that's fundamentally what it is. And again, it's from... like what the Future Gospel side of things is from is in 2008, Nasu and Takeuchi wrote, or Nasu wrote and then Takeuchi illustrated a new 2 sets of chapters. Both of those chapters are like the 2 sections of the movie, right? The stuff that takes place in the 90s, and then there's the 2010 section. Those are the 2 different chapters, although it was 2008 in the book version. And so they made that and sold those in a 2008 comic market. And Takeuchi, as a part of that, created these kind of interlude chapters as manga sections that he wrote and illustrated that were part of that as well. And so they took those manga kind of side chapters and made this like Blu-ray OVA kind of extra feature and put that in with the home video release, which is where all this sort of originally comes from.
Yeah, and I think you can feel that with extra chorus, but the rest of this stuff is great, and I think Future Gospel fits right in with the main saga as I feel like I don't know if essential is the right word because the original 7 finish very definitively, but I'm really happy it exists.
Yeah, it's weird because it's like I think you can feel very much, even though the movies all came out in a relatively similar time period. The movie came out in 2013 for Future Gospel, so there's a bigger gap, right? It goes from 2009 to 2013, so that's a bigger gap than any of the other movies, but it's not a huge jump in time. But you can feel, I think, with the content of the movie that really you're getting this kind of look back at a series that at that point was 10 years old. Like, they wrote it as part of the 10th year anniversary of Garden of Sinners because it originally came out in 1998, the light novel version, or the original, not even the light novel, the doujinshi chapters for the final chapter came out in 1998. So that's that 10-year gap when they sold those new chapters at that new comic market. And you can feel this sort of nostalgic looking back nature of it as a movie, even though the movies themselves are not actually that old.
Well, and even though I had only started watching Kara no Kyoukai a couple months ago for this project, it felt nostalgic to me watching it, of going back to these characters in a slightly simpler time in their life. Not that these characters ever have simple times in their lives, yes. But slightly simpler time, and seeing that and just enjoying, I think that movie does some fun things with, it's probably the section in the present day of Kara no Kyoukai, or I guess it would be the past, but the 90s. 98, I guess, is when most of it is set.
Yes.
That part is maybe the most straightforward procedural thing in the whole series, and you're just getting to watch, Shiki and Kokuto kind of do their thing, and I think it's really a fun and interesting story that they've come up with for that, and then there's a very sweet sort of epilogue on it. It's very good. And then the epilogue itself is one of the most Kinoko Nasu ass things ever written, and I love it, and I'm excited to talk about all of it.
Yeah, so let's just fucking get into it. Let's just talk about them in the order they came out in. I don't think we'll have a huge amount to say about Extra Chorus, but we can touch some of those things at the end. But let's start with the epilogue. So I don't know when, in terms of the writing, when the epilogue was originally written. I do not know if it was part of the original doujinshi releases or if it was written as part of the light novels, because I've seen stuff that's inconsistent, and obviously I can't get my hands on the original doujinshi versions of these chapters because those are very obscure and only exist in physical copies in Japan. So I do not know if this was part of the original version of the story or if Nasu added it on later, because you can feel that the chapter 7, which is what we got in the 7th movie, has a very clear ending point. So it's the epilogue doesn't feel like a thing that is, to me, necessarily essential for the overall story. If they had never adapted this, I don't think there would be anything wrong. In fact, it is hilarious to imagine a version of the 7th movie that had this epilogue edited into the end of it. Would be the most alienating experience I can imagine for a general audience. It would be just bizarre. But if you buy the light novels today, the version I bought digitally from Bookwalker, has this epilogue at the end, which brings Kokuto back full circle to the earliest point in the timeline, which is the beginning of the 2nd chapter, when he encounters Shiki before he knows her, standing on the side of this road in the snow, looking out over the city, and he sees her, and then when he meets her again during the school opening ceremony, she doesn't remember him, right? And there's this little tiny plot hole there that this technically fills in, that you find out why, who was this weird, mysterious, almost kind of spectral vision of Shiki that he saw, that she has no recollection of ever encountering Kokuto before. And so this epilogue brings you back full circle after the events of the 7th movie, and he encounters this Shiki again, and then has a very long philosophical conversation. And as far as I can tell, looking through the epilogue that I have from Bookwalker, I believe this is literally the entire thing. There might be, I didn't comb through line by line to 100% check, but I'm pretty sure you could more or less take the audio from this epilogue and release it as just an audiobook version of that epilogue, because it is just word for word straight through. When I was watching it and I looked at a clip of it and pulled up the Bookwalker section, I was like, nope, they're just reading this whole thing off. line for line, and it is just a dialogue between these two people. And it's really fascinating to me that in this visual, like when turning it into a visual medium, they don't really do anything to take it out of that space, right? Which I think is the thing that you would instinctively do in adapting something that is just a conversation between two people, particularly in animation, is you would express things more with other kinds of visual elements to emphasize stuff. And they don't. Like, all you see for the entire 30 minutes are shots either of Kokuto, shots of Shiki, shots of them together, or shots of the city and like the sky around it and just the setting. And that's it for the full 30 minutes. And it's just a conversation between these two people. And this epilogue has always been, to me, one of the most striking things in Kata no Kyokai. I think it's like one of the most challenging things to engage with as a viewer. But it's also visually, whenever I think of this series, the thing I always think of is this image of them standing on the side of the road looking at the like orange light diffuse through the snow of this like wintry, snowy night. There's something about this epilogue that I find very haunting and has always stuck with me.
Oh yeah, it's pretty incredible. And even though I don't have the light novels to look at, I was not surprised to hear you say this, because that was pretty much, I'm looking at this, I'm like, this must just be the dialogue from the book straight, because it is a 33-minute OVA and all of it is talking. And yet the fine folks at Ufotable are so ludicrously fucking talented, it might be the most stylistically striking thing in this entire project, which is saying something for a project that includes things like Paradox Spiral and the final of the 7 movies and, you know, all the other crazy things this series has produced. But it is all set on this snowy road. The atmosphere is so goddamn thick you could cut it with a knife. I don't even remember, is there even any, like, background music going on in this one? If it is, it's very light and in the back.
Yeah. There is background music, but it is very light, yes.
Yeah, it's not like the big attention-grabbing tracks. So it is really the two voice actors, and it is the cityscape, and it is these incredible images of, as you say, the orange light of the city, or the light that, when diffused through the snow, becomes orange. There's this sort of light pollution effect going on, but then also it is just a absolute cavalcade of interesting camera angles and interesting shot compositions and sort of abstract imagery around them as they're talking. It's not like overbearing. It doesn't feel like they're like trying to like, you know, wave a big book in one hand and a puppet in the other hand to like distract you from the depths of what's going on. It's like they are really trying to, I think, illustrate the kind of liminality of the conversation itself through the eeriness of this liminal space, to the degree where, like, I think it would be a reasonable interpretation to say this is a dream, the way it like comes across, even though it does fill in a, as you say, what's technically a plot hole, although I hadn't even really thought of it until I saw this epilogue. I didn't kind of think back to that and go, oh, you know what, that does explain something. But it is, you know, this very deep, in-depth philosophical conversation that kind of cuts to the heart of a lot of the things Nasu is interested in these novels. And then I think Ufotable illustrating it in the absolutely striking way they do, where it feels liminal, it feels like a dream, it almost feels like two people meeting in the afterlife. And just shot after shot after shot. It's extremely overwhelming and difficult to engage with, more so than I imagine it actually would be on the page, because there are these two things overlapping where it probably took me an hour to watch through this, because I'm rewinding, seeing lines again. I would find myself looking at the images and then not paying attention to the dialogue and being like, I gotta go back, because there's just so much kind of overwhelming you sensorially and intellectually. And it's such a fascinating curveball for your final bit of story in this thing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's really impressive about it to me in that visual sense is that there's nothing extreme happening. Like you could imagine more or less this being shot in live action. Like, there's nothing about it as a piece of animation. They're not doing anything insane. They're not depicting anything fantastical. You're not blowing up a giant fucking bridge or showing a guy like jumping around, like bouncing off the walls of this warehouse with a knife trying to stab someone. It's all two people on the side of the road having a conversation. And they don't use stuff that anime likes to do a lot when you're talking about philosophical stuff, where you have maybe abstract imagery that you can cut to that just directly illustrates whatever philosophical point is being made, or which Kado no Kyokai doesn't typically do, but you do often have in like scenes with Toko. She is usually doing something physically to demonstrate what she's talking about, right? Like the clearest one being like the Russian nesting dolls, talking about the origin and stuff. So usually the things are framed and like played out in action and visual way that helps reinforce directly what's being discussed. Whereas here, it is just finding interesting ways to frame and composite two people talking. But within that visual space, they find this weird way to sort of just like really flex their animation muscles, because there are shots that are incredibly fluid and striking, that are just about like hair blowing in the wind and the camera slowly coming in. I think my favorite shot, and I think the thing that is certainly from an animation perspective, I think the most impressive shot in the whole thing is one where the camera starts slowly doing a close-up on Kokuto's face as it is turning around, and his hair is slowly blowing, and it's all in slow motion, and it comes around his back, over his shoulder, and then moves slowly into a close-up on Shiki's face. And it's long. It's like maybe a minute-long uncut sequence, and it's that thing where in animation, if you want to do something that is a slow motion camera move or whatever, that just means you have to draw a stupid number of frames in order to sell the sensation that this movement is happening slowly and incredibly gracefully. And so it's a sequence where you could pause and look frame by frame, and every frame looks fucking perfect. It must be drawn on ones, because it is so dramatic. That camera sweep, it is so meticulous and perfect feeling that it is such a mundane thing that they are showing. We're coming in on this dude's face, going around his shoulder, going over to this woman's face, but we're going to take an entire minute basically to do it. And to do that in animation, you have to be absolutely perfect to sell that camera move. And it is just like, every time I've seen this epilogue, which is like, maybe I think this would be the third time I've watched it all the way through, that shot just like strikes me every time of like, Jesus fucking Christ. They spent a lot of time thinking about how to compose these shots, do these camera moves, and draw it all out as animation.
It's so aesthetically rich that despite like the depths and the density of the conversation that is being had, if you muted it and you watched it as like a silent film, there is still a story being told. Mm-hmm. And it is like, and it would be a kind of weird avant-garde story because it would be two people standing around in the snow in this weird orange light. But yeah, it is incredible. When you talk about this being like something you could do in live action, there aren't that many more common scenes, I feel like, in contemporary Japanese like drama and stuff than two people standing on the side of a snowy road that's on a hill, and this town is below them, and they're by the guardrail, and they're like, that's just like a very like Drive My Car, which was the big like hit from last year, 2021, that people loved, the Ryusuke Hamaguchi movie. Has that like 5 times. It's just a very common image, but of course the reason to do it in animation is because you can take this very common imagery, this almost like archetypal imagery, and suddenly make it like deeply impressionistic. And I don't mean impressionistic strictly in like the art movement sense, like Van Gogh or something, but like it feels like this is what this moment feels like, not what this moment looked like, you know? And you just feel something looking at it beyond, and this is before we get to any of the actual like kind of complicated issues going on here, because I do feel like this is probably the most like complicated in terms of like philosophy and ideas piece of writing in Kara no Kyokai. There's other stuff that in terms of plot is more complicated. This doesn't even really have a plot, but there's so much going on here, and yet the aesthetic layer is so rich, and that's the ufotable magic. That's why these two go together so well, is because Kinoko Nasu can provide these incredibly dense, scripts and stories and ideas, and then ufotable will not just adapt that, they will create their own other layer of density in the aesthetic realm on top of it, and that's an incredible thing to marry together.
Yeah, and it's the other thing is we're on the visuals and the imagery. It's how perfect they capture the snow and the light of the city. It's like, I've said it before, where Nasu, to me, and like all of his works, even though Kado no Kyokai, the majority of the series takes place technically over the summer, it always feels like winter. It is such like a wintry tone that he has in his writing. And when we get to Fate is set during the winter. And like a lot of the aesthetic you see here is a lot of the aesthetic of the Fate series, where it's like you have the bridge in Fuyuki City where that series is set, which is this like red bridge that usually has this kind of like orange light from the lights at night with the snow. It's like very much the same kind of style. But especially as someone who now, this is my second winter in Texas, and I've not seen snow since I moved out of Colorado. There's something in particular about seeing this where it like, I got a real like homesick feeling all of a sudden watching it because of how perfectly it captures that specific look of orange light diffused through a snowy night. That particularly, like, it makes me feel like when I was in my old family home looking out over like our kind of like backyard area where our house backed up onto this like big kind of open lot, this kind of big open park area. And then past that park area, way down, you know, if you drove miles and miles, you'd hit Denver. So you could see Denver from the windows at like the back of my house, or if you sat on our backyard. So you would get this exact effect, like much more diffuse because it's way further away. But you would definitely get that sort of the way the light pollution permeates and diffracts through the snow to create this kind of like glowing massive halo kind of effect. And so it just really hit me really hard watching this. And again, this is the image. Whenever I think of Koda no Kyoukai, the thing I think of isn't even the characters. It is just the city at night with that orange glow coming through the snow. And I think it says a lot about how much they're able to capture that look that, as you say, there's almost an impressionistic quality to it in terms of the ultimate effect it has on the viewer, where it just like, it hits you really hard that they have captured that image, the essence of what that image and the color and the feel of it is so perfectly.
Yeah, considering our parents' houses were within walking distance, I know exactly what you're talking about,
yes.
And I felt it too. And it's incredible. I actually watched most of these on my laptop. And if there's anime I really care about, actually, I do tend to watch it on my MacBook Pro because it has the best and most sort of color accurate screen I own, even more so than my TV. And it's a mini LED screen, and it does HDR, but even with works that, like, this isn't technically in HDR, obviously, it still kind of creates that effect if there's like kind of strong light sources and stuff. And so the lighting in this OVA is so ludicrously good. Like the way it like just refracts off of things, and it's weird to talk about lighting in animation because for the most part, lighting in anime is just different colors drawn to look like lighting, right? Mm-hmm. You do now in digital anime, you will have like literal light sources put in that is like a program doing dynamic lighting sometimes. And I think there's probably a little bit of that going on here, but mostly it is just, this is so fucking beautifully drawn. It just is like, just on like looking at it on that screen was like unbelievable, like to see the richness of the colors and the palette. One thing we haven't even mentioned is the dress Shiki is wearing, which I think this is only the second time we've seen it outside of episode 2, and it is this pink dress with the kimono with the purple sash around it, and it looks almost otherworldly, like it glows a little bit. They've clearly done this like kind of like texture work on it where it's an incredibly like rich actual like piece of like, you know, designed fabric and costume that they've then put onto this animation, and the way she almost feels like she's emanating from the scenery. It's because the Shiki we're seeing here is effectively a ghost in like a certain sense, mm-hmm. right? It is the Shiki who exists between the Shikis. It's this thing that is not quite alive, and the way the dress itself, the kimono itself, like signifies that. And then, of course, you have Kokuto, who in his adult age with his missing eye now is all in black all the time and looks sick. Even his fucking umbrella is black. It's just a really striking contrast.
Yes, yeah, having the ghostly pale white Shiki and then the all black Kokuto, yes, who like very much stands out. You know, Kokuto has such a strong silhouette in all the images because he's like exists in a different color space than everything else, right? Because everything else, even though it's at night, everything is glowing because of the light and because of what the snow has done to the light. And so he like just like stands out like a sore thumb in every single shot. And so like, you know, Jonathan, you shared a bunch of screenshots you took, and it's fun just to scroll through them and see like how they use the blackness of Kokuto to frame a lot of these shots, and to like really kind of give them that, like, your eye is drawn to him every time he is used. And so all the compositions really use that effectively.
Yeah, it's really interesting. They also do some great stuff with Kokuto's like movement at the beginning of this thing, where he's walking up the hill and then he sees Shiki and walks over to her, and he's of course got the bad leg now, and so he's dragging that leg along, and that's his left leg, and walking normally on his right leg, and so they're doing this thing where he's got normal footprints on the right, and then the left is just dragged, and it's a line through the snow, and the way they like do all of that is also like, boy, there's a lot of frames of animation here on the snow to make it look good, but it's so striking because it immediately kind of, you know, it signifies where we are in the story, that this is the end point, that this is after the incidents of episode 7, and that this is a Kokuto who literally moves through the world differently because of the things that happened to him in that last film.
Yes. And then maybe that can kind of transition us a little bit into the story stuff, because this is where part of like what is happening here in the story is you have this Shiki that we'll talk about, like what is this character, this new version of Shiki, but she is asking Kokuto, like fundamentally what is happening in a plot sense, I suppose, is she is asking Kokuto what is his desire, wanting to restore to him like what he was, right? Because he has lost these things through his experiences. He's lost his eye, he's lost the use of one of his legs effectively, or like lost much of the use of one of his legs. And she has the ability to heal him, and he refuses it. Like that is like what is happening from a like plot point of view. And then they have this long philosophical conversation about the nature of all those things and all those steps along the process of who these two people are, what it means to have those desires, what it means to not have those desires, most specifically for Kokuto. And so, yes, so it's like his sort of injuries and his, how changed he is as a person. This is the most time we spend with this post movie 7 Kokuto. You get that little tiny piece at the very, very end of movie 7, which is this much like happier, less complicated version of the ending of this story, where he and she get to be together. They have both been changed. They both carry scars from this adventure. This is this much less settled, more complicated version of this story and how this ends, and a much more, I think, appropriately Kara no Kyoukai version at the ending. I think the epilogue is important, is because it unsettles that settled ground again, and it leaves it in a more confused and sort of less sort of happily ever after kind of state, which I think is appropriate for the franchise, that you get kind of both of those versions of the ending offered to you. But you have this very changed version of Kokuto, and he's like very strikingly looks very different. He looks so much older. His hair, right, changes the entire aesthetic of the character, I think, here. And so him refusing to be brought back, right, to that state that he used to be, refusing to be healed, refusing to have those kinds of desires that you would expect a person to have, because who would not want to get the use of their eye back? Who would not want to be able to just like magically have their leg be healed with no consequences? But he truly has no desire for basically anything. And that's kind of like the point of the conversation happening here.
Yeah, I mean, it literally ends on this point that we've talked about many times in these conversations, of bringing us back to this observation I made in the Japanimation Station season premiere this year, of like, as weird as you've got Shiki running around bathing in people's blood, there's something about Kokuto that freaked me out more. That's this like thing I said about episode 2, and that has stuck with me throughout all of this. And I feel like that's also, I mean, literally that is the note that this series goes out on. And it is, but it's also like a broader, as is the sort of Kinoko Nasu fashion, it is also a broader point about humanity and human desire and human philosophy. And I wouldn't necessarily call it a dark ending. It's neither the, obviously, like these sort of, fairy tale is wrong given what happens in episode 7, but the like sort of happier ending there. But it is this, it's exactly what you're saying. It literally leaves us in a liminal state, which is what this whole kind of scene that this epilogue is kind of about, where you are left sort of reflecting on it in this liminality where it is unresolvable. And I think, as you say, Sean, that does feel right. You know, I enjoy Future Gospel a lot. It's one of my favorite movies in the Kara no Kyoukai series. But I do think there's something about that one ends on a fairly pat kind of note that kind of aims to make you feel a little better about like male Shiki and the sacrifice and all of that. And that just rang a tad bit false to me in the way this rings like, yes, this is Kara no Kyoukai. This is the like the kind of unresolvability feels so right here, you know?
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about what this version of Shiki is, right? Because that's part of this whole story as well, which again, we have met this version technically one other time at the very beginning of movie 2. But this is a very, very different version. This is yet another character that Sakamoto Maya is asked to play. Like we haven't asked you to play enough versions of this character yet. Let's have you do this one more time, because I do think she does a very good job of embodying the sense that this is yet a different person, you know, with the same body, or arguably just simply is the body itself, is speaking with the same timbre and quality of voice, but comes across as truly a different personality. And the thing that she tells us is that she is, as you kind of alluded to earlier, she is the Shiki between Shikis, right? That the Shiki personalities we know, the female and male Shiki, the yin and the yang, right? The one who always accepts and the one that always rejects. Those are polar opposites, and those are personalities that have been driven to these extreme poles, that no human personality really should be that polarized. Nobody can actually be on one end or the other. Nobody is purely good. Nobody's purely evil. Nobody is all yin. Nobody is all yang. These two personalities have been pushed to those two extremes. And so something needs to exist as to the medium that fills that gap. And that is what this Shiki is. And she is the personality that is generated not from the mind or the soul, but is the personality generated purely from the physical body. And so there's a long conversation had that's kind of like really the first half of the epilogue, more or less, is them talking about what is the nature of a personality, or a jinkaku, which is the Japanese term they're using that's translated here as personality, which I think is a good translation. And it's like, where does the personality come from? What is it? Like, where does it reside? Like physically in the body, where does it reside? And what does it, and then by extension, then what does it mean to be human? And Kokuto takes, I think, what is like the normal thing, that the way that we normally think of ourselves and understand ourselves as being these creatures born of intelligence and reason or whatever. It exists, who we are and what we are exists primarily in our mind. It is our brain. Like if it has to be located somewhere specifically, it would be in the brain, and that's what we are. And then this Shiki tells us that it is wrong, and that in fact, like an essential part of what makes up the human creature, and therefore the thing that ultimately the personality is generated from, isn't from the mind or the intelligence. It comes fundamentally from the body, and that the intelligence is like a cipher or a filter that interprets those things. But that fundamentally what we are in our personality is something that comes from the body and cannot be separated from the body. And should you be a hypothetical human that had no body and was just like an intelligence that existed amorphously, or just a brain in a jar or whatever, that had no sense of self and no sense of like the corporeal world, and existed in an entirely intellectual space, that thing couldn't be considered human, nor could it be considered to have a human personality, because who and what we are comes fundamentally from the bodies that we live in and how we are embodied in corporeal space.
Yes. It's an amazing conversation, and it comes back to something I've said many times in our Kara no Kyoukai reviews so far, which is that the magic of Kinoko Nasu's writing is that this could so easily be the point where this series disappears up its own ass, right? Like, this is, you did a very good job summarizing what is like 15 minutes of conversation, right? And it is this like long Socratic dialogue between Shiki and Kokuto about like, what am I? I'm a personality. Like, where does this personality reside? What is the difference here? Why is Shiki special? Blah, blah, blah. And again, if the writing were just 1% less good, I do think it would like disappear up its own ass. And instead it is fascinating. And I found that throughout Kara no Kyoukai. I've been reading through, because it came out recently from when we're recording this, Mahotsukai no Yoru, The Witch on the Holy Night, which is now out in English, the visual novel. And I haven't even gotten to what I would probably consider the plot of that visual novel so far, because it's long. and nothing has really technically happened yet in it. I'm like 2.5 chapters through, and yet it is the same thing where utter inanity can be going on. I'll be like, this is some of the best written stuff I've ever seen, and I'm enraptured in it. And I think this is just that kind of effect. And that is, obviously, I've read less of his stuff than you have, Sean, but it's just when I say like, oh man, I'm on this wavelength, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about, because it is such an interesting conversation. You know, the entire idea of, and there's actually like, there's literal like logic to this. You know, there's a famous book by a doctor named Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, which is a recent book on trauma, and the way that like trauma is literally, you know, stored in the body, and is something, I'm probably not describing this that well, but it is this idea of like trauma is something that you can't like reason through. It is something that is like stored within us. And it like, that's something I was thinking about watching this and going through this. It's like, oh, this is actually like, there are ideas that actually do match up with this beyond just kind of the philosophy we're getting here. It's really fascinating.
Well, I think that is one of the things that makes Nasu's stuff different than other times you encounter some of these ideas, is that it's like, he clearly like knows what he's talking about. Like, he's clearly read on this stuff. Like, he's not pulling things completely out of his ass. And then he's also, I think, he's exploring areas of philosophy that I think are more interesting because they feel more real, right? It's less of like your kind of Freudian psychoanalysis stuff that you get in other stuff, like, let's say, Eva, you know, like Neon Genesis Evangelion, that has a lot of its like kind of philosophizing that, you know, in some places, like in the movies, can be pretty good, but oftentimes in the TV show was very eye-rolly, or it felt like it was there for show more than it was like actually fully invested in it. Whereas here, like, I think the thing I find interesting about it is engaging with it is that some of these are concepts that, like, and university studying like literature, this was some stuff that like we would talk about and like things that you would look at and consider, and I think are, and that I would fundamentally agree with as well. Like, I think that the Shiki is right. Like, I think that the personality, you cannot separate the human from the body, and that it is true that there is a long history of humans considering themselves as being separate from those things. Like, this is a lot of like the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason and some of those ideals, in this like want to be these creatures of perfect reason, or these creatures of intelligence that separates us from like the animal world, or like our carnal desires or corporeal needs, and that those are just things that need be taken care of as a matter of fact, just of the nature of our existence, but aren't things that composite the essential of what it is to be human. Whereas no, that is like all the other stuff is extras, like the reason and the intelligence, like that's a little bonus that we get to like play with. But what we are essentially are those needs and desires and the physical experiences we have. And our body does in so many ways determine and define how we think of ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, how we move through the world. Like, that comes from our body. And should you have been someone who was born in a different body, you would have become a different person, because you would have had different experiences. The world would have seen you. Society would have seen and treated you in different ways. And like, I think it is right to think in many ways that our intelligence is a cipher on top of these sorts of more fundamental instincts and needs and desires and wants that the body has, that the mind then interprets. And so that you can't separate the need to like eat and sleep and drink and stuff to survive. Those are fundamental elements of what we are that comes from our body and our need to maintain our body, that then fundamentally must define our personality. And so I think like one of the things that makes this engaging from a philosophical point of view is that it feels real. Like, it feels like a proper thing to consider that has a grounding in real experiences and a real understanding of what it is to be human, that's actually engaging with those ideas rather than offering them up as sort of like a topping or whatever to exoticize whatever is going on otherwise in your story, or as something that is has no basis in reality. That is just you pulling something out of your ass, and it's like you trying to like sound philosophical but isn't grounded in real human experiences the way that I think that this is.
Or asking questions that are like so impossibly broad, there's no like actual like meaningful discussion that can come out of it, right? Like, I don't know, like, what is goodness and where does it come from? Like something that like, I don't know, your classic like philosophy that's either going to lead you to religion or other forms of morality, but at a certain point you're being so broad with it, it might not even be productive. And I feel like this is what I mean when I say it could so easily disappear up its own ass. That is the certain episodes of Evangelion version of this. This is the, all sorts of things you've seen. This is the, just like your fucking college philosophy class where people just want to show off, right? And sound smart without being smart. And this is actually smart. This is actually interesting. And it's engaged with ideas that are there throughout the whole series because bodies and what happens to bodies is so much of what this series is. I mean, it is a show where they are often tracking serial killers doing grisly murders. There's all this stuff about, seeing bodies dismembered and taken apart. There's the line that we talked a lot about in film 3 with the Shiki talking about the like piles of meat that this person has created. And, you have that. You have Shiki literally losing an arm over the course of this story. You have Kokuto losing parts of his body over the course of this story. Bodily engagement is a major part of this series, and that's also why I think this feels in place,
Yeah, and because also, like, a big one of those is then obviously Toko as well, right? In her dolls, which is another point of fascination of, like, her ability to perfectly recreate the human body in doll form is the perfection of what she considers her, or she calls them puppets, her, puppet making art as a mage. And once she has managed to make a perfect replication of herself in her own body, that is then, she has achieved it. She perceives no further purpose in trying to advance her skills or whatever. There's no way to go beyond that because she has now created a perfect replica of herself. And then once her knowledge and her ideas are transplanted into that body, it is still her. It is exactly her. But it is fundamental that it is her body in exact detail replicated to perfection in exacting detail in that puppet that then is able to create an exact clone of her. It is not, This would be something that disagrees perhaps with something like Ghost in the Shell, which has a similar kind of element to the end of that story where the Major's knowledge or whatever is transplanted into a different body, but is a very different body. But that I think Ghost in the Shell does wants to believe more in that there is an abstract intelligence that is the fundamental essence of what we are. That is the ghost in the shell, and the ghost part is maybe more important than the shell. And I would say that this kind of disagrees with some of those notions. It would actually be an interesting two series to put in conversation with each other, because I think they're interested in pretty similar ideas but come to different conclusions. But yes, it is. You're right. One of the things that makes it feel good here and appropriate and something you want to engage with in the epilogue is that these are not themes that have come out of nowhere. I think they're themes that the show has never zeroed in on. None of the other movies are specifically about this idea, but it is an omnipresent theme throughout all of the different other chapters. This is just the moment where we're kind of really picking this out as the specific idea we're going to focus on for this section of the story.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, all the stuff about, gender that this series has, what is that other than a discussion about that sort of gap between perception and the body, right? And how Shiki dresses and presents and all of that. I think the Ghost in the Shell comparison is interesting because Ghost in the Shell is a very, very good version of a pretty common idea in sci-fi and philosophy, right? It's exactly what you were talking about of Enlightenment ideals, even, just basic religious ideals of the soul being something separate from the body that lives on after, and so you can have, Ghost in the Shell, Blade Runner, all sorts of sci-fi, right, does this of the difference between sort of the body and the mind and the spirit, or, however you want to define these things. And Ghost in the Shell is about as good a version of that as you're going to see in modern fiction. And this is an interesting counterpoint, and it's a good example of this is an actually rich philosophical discussion because you can have very good developed arguments on both of these ends, even if they seem, mutually exclusive, right? And it's fascinating, and this definitely feels like a very developed version of this argument that feels, I don't even know if I would not have been able to pinpoint this as a theme of the series until it comes up here, but then you go back and I feel like again, another reason I want to rewatch Kara no Kyoukai at some point is because there's all these ideas that now I feel like I would be reading the series so differently or so much more richly because of this.
Absolutely, yes. I had the same experience, yes. I think this highlighting it puts a spotlight on the fact that it has been a thing this show has been dealing with the entire time. Another element here I like about what it is doing with philosophy is that it's blending this stuff, which feels more broadly derived from different kind of Western and European philosophical branches, and it is blending it with right? More what we'd associate with like Eastern philosophies with like the yin and yang elements that have been there the entire time, right? Because you have your yin and yang or yin and yo, the Japanese terms, which are your two different I say bipolar personalities in the sense that they are two personalities on the end of either pole. Not to say that's like not the medical condition. But you have those two different polar personalities, and then you have this medium as the thing that sort of interprets it, but is also the, like, in many ways, what the shiki is the whole, right? It is the full thing. It is the taiji, or taikyoku, the supreme ultimate. That's what they translated as in episode 5. This is the shiki that sort of commands over all of this, because she is the source from which all these two different things are born. She is both like the space that exists between them and like the space that gave birth to these personalities. And so that is why she like arguably this entity, this shiki, is in all of the Nasu verse, like one of, if not technically like the most powerful entity. Like if you look at Fate and other things where you have very powerful entities or creatures that exist in this universe, this shiki could theoretically, as she say, like recreate everything, because she is a direct access to the root, right? Or whatever they translated to here. That idea of the Akashic record or whatever, of this fundamental place that exists at the root of all of existence, where all things that are, that were, and that could ever be exist in like perfect harmony and all that kind of stuff, that she is an access to that. This is a thing that like Soren has trying to get in movie 5 with Paradox Spiral. This is like that idea. She is that portal to that thing. She is a connection to emptiness and nothingness, because she is a personality that shouldn't exist. The body shouldn't have a defined personality. The body's the thing that creates the personality. So she's a thing that shouldn't exist but does, and that gives her like this kind of power. But she also has no desire because of what she is, right? She's a personality that can't and shouldn't exist on the outside. So even though she technically has access to anything that one could do in all of creation, something I find interesting about the shiki is like she mentions this line where it's like, I could like recreate all of exists here, you have it here. I can restructure the laws of substances so minute they're imperceptible, or I can even unravel the origin of the planet and change evolution. I wouldn't be remaking the existing world. This is the line I like. I wouldn't be remaking the existing world. Rather, I'd be crushing the old world in my hand with a new world, right? She could replace all of existence at her own will, because she has access to the fundamentals of what the world is, but there's no reason for her to do it. There's nothing she wants to accomplish. She is just a body. And there's something very haunting about this. I think all these ideas you get of like merging these two ideas of the taiji and of this sort of like bodied personality that shouldn't be like personified in any way, but because of what has happened to her, it has been. And merging these two things together is a very like, I think a compelling experiment, I guess, that this story does.
Well, right, and this is part of why the epilogue, I think, feels so necessary as a piece of this story, is that this is the thing Soren is looking for the whole time, right?
Yes.
And we see it here, and also in seeing it and learning about it, we also get, I think, the clearest indication yet, and this is hinted at in Paradox Spiral and elsewhere with the whole idea of like the clapback, the like opposing force, right? But
yes.
That what Soren was trying to do was impossible. He never could have done it, because he has this, because he desires to do it, right? Like that is the thing. Uh-huh. Because he desires to do it, he can't actually get to the point of nothingness that would allow him to be this thing. Because this shiki body's whole explanation is that they never would have existed because they're born from emptiness. The whole line about we're doomed to perish inside our mother's placentas because it would be pointless for us to be born. But since emptiness is nothingness, then our intelligence is nothingness as well. And then, that is how we get this relationship to the source, to the root, whatever you call it. And then it is because of the unique nature of Shiki and the Ryogi family that this thing comes into existence. But this thing coming into existence, then it's because it's such an interesting idea. It is, as you say, like this most powerful figure we've met, but so powerful that power is also meaningless, right? Because it's never going to do anything. This thing does not propose, like, there's no danger to the world. while she could crush the world in her hand with a new world, she's not going to, because that would require desire. But requiring desire means that you wouldn't be able to do it. Like, that whole thing is so fascinating to me. And I think this leads to the other half of this epilogue, which is the idea of, like, well, what is the nature of Kokuto in his sort of undesiring fashion? And I think there's multiple ways you can read this. And one thing I've been thinking of throughout this whole conversation, Sean, is that in some ways, Kokuto does actually get all of this on a very deep level, because he is someone who lacks many of these desires, because he is someone who accepts what his body is and doesn't ask for it to be changed. Well, in a sense, if the body is the thing that produces the personality, what would it mean for him to have his body remade to what it used to be? Like, would that... Like, maybe there's something very healthy, actually, in Kokuto just accepting, no, this is what... I'm not me if you reverse this, right? Because this is what I am now. He doesn't say that, but I feel like that is something that is in between the lines. There's this understanding that they come to because Kokuto is sort of closer to this person than I think this Shiki realized at the beginning. It's so interesting.
Yes, absolutely. Because I do think that that is the conclusion you get to here, is that in his own mundane way, that is what Kokuto is, right? He's like, obviously he doesn't have like the power. He is not like the embodiment of these things, but who he is as a person, like, is approaching this sort of like uncomfortable totality, or this wholeness, right? That's part of the idea of like the Taiji with the yin yang thing, that's the combined, it's the full symbol, right? Is that if you were to embody that thing as the Shiki does, like you couldn't have a desire, because you are brought into like this completeness or this wholeness, right? Part of the thing of like the yin and yang is that if you, as a human, you don't exist as a totality of all these elements. You're being pushed to and forth on this, in this like polar sense on that spectrum. And so it's almost like, the Force or something in Star Wars, that it's like you're being pushed and pulled between these two different states at all times. And so that's where your desires and your needs, your sense of incompleteness comes from. And, Soren, is a good example of someone who has such an intense desire that he wants to have that power, but that in and of itself is proof that he's existing in the midst of that dichotomy, and he's being pushed and influenced by its forces because he isn't whole yet. And should he become whole, he would then lose his desire, because he would see the fullness of all things and see that it is in harmony, that it is perfect, that it is all balanced. And that like Kokuto has kind of accepted something similar in his own way, right? With his own life of his like sort of uncomfortable normality, that the kind of part of what Shiki says here near the end is stuff about how like being ordinary is a thing that like is not a thing that people try to be. It's a thing that people become because they tried to be special, right? And that is the proper way for humans to be, is to try to have the ambitions to be something more. You believe you're going to be important. You believe you're going to be special. You believe that you're, hey, I'm a teacher. I work with a bunch of teenagers. I know they all think they're the most fucking important person in the goddamn world. And all of them think it. It's like, and it's obviously not true, because if all of you think it, well, guess what? You're not all individually the most important thing to have ever existed in all of existence. But that's what people, very egotistically and selfishly like believe or need to believe about themselves. And then as you age, you get more perspective and you settle more into a kind of comfortable existence. Kokuto is someone who's just done that his entire life. He never went through that journey. He never had that arrogance. He never had that ambition. He never had that belief for himself. And we see that in Asuka's flashback when we saw little kid Kokuto. And he was the fucking same thing at like 10 years old that he is at like 20 years old, right? Like, it's like the dude has never changed. He's always felt and acted and believed that way. And that is what makes him fucking bizarre, is that he has always just lived that ordinary neutral life, because that is the only thing that he really wants.
Really, this is a story about two people who are both missing pieces of what we consider humanity, right? Now, of course, that is also every love story ever made, is about two people who are missing things that the other one fills in. And that is why Kara no Kyoukai is ultimately a love story. But it's a love story that goes to these extremes and, like, really, I think, gets into these prickly issues. But I want to go through some of this writing that you're referencing here, Sean, because it is such fucking tremendous dialogue. and like so rich and interesting. The thing that kind of kicks off the final conversation of the series effectively is Shiki is trying to offer him, you know, this remaking of his body, and she says, "Don't you want a more enjoyable tomorrow than you had today?" And he says, "Well, I'm enjoying myself right now. That's enough for me, you see." And that is which is the most fucking Kokuto line possible. And then it kicks into Shiki saying, "I see. To live having no characteristics, never wishing for yourself to become special, you never hurt anyone else, so you never get hurt yourself. You never steal from others, so you never gain anything. Never making any waves, you just blend into time and live an average life, then quietly draw your last breath. That's the kind of ordinary neutral life that you all lead. However, that's just the end result, nothing more. Most people don't lead that kind of life because they want it. The result of trying to become special only to fail, that's the shape of a human who leads an ordinary life. And that's why the most difficult task is to try to live such a life from the start." Fucking hell. That is an amazing piece of writing, and also something of a thesis for the series, of this whole project. It's so fascinating to me.
Yeah, one thing I do have to really give props to is whoever was the person who translated the epilogue. I don't know if it was the same person translating all of it, but I think they did an especially good job here capturing Nasu's voice, because it's like all the writing of the translation is incredibly good, and I think it's very like accurate to what is being said in Japanese, which is good because it's like these are complex ideas, so you need something that's like, you know, getting the proper idea across, but it's also written in that kind of almost slightly poetic tone that Nasu typically has. Like, it's, you know, he has a very kind of flavorful voice to his writing, and so much of it comes across in the subtitles here.
Yeah. But yeah, the whole complexity and circle of that idea, it's kind of like Shiki is like Toko on steroids in terms of like the ability to see the world logically. And it is such an interesting observation about Kokuto being the end form of most people, but skipping the step of trying to be special, as he says. But then on the other end, you know, Kokuto has this rejoinder of there might not be a human being who isn't special. You know, we each have completely different purposes in life. We huddle together as living beings. We live to turn the gaps between us, which we don't see eye to eye, into boundaries of emptiness. I believe that's the only time the title of the series is name-checked in the show, because he literally says Kara no Kyoukai. Even though we know such a day will never come, we go on living with that dream intact. It must be the same for every one of us, the one thing that seems natural to us. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is good stuff.
It's very good stuff.
And then you have Shiki's final monologue, which is the end of the whole series. Uniqueness that no one will ever understand. Universality that no one ever tries to understand. Because he's so ordinary in everybody's eyes, no one will ever try to really understand him. Someone who will never be hated by others, but will also never attract anyone. He appears to be the crystallization of blissful days. If that's true, then she's not the one who's actually all alone. You're going to live as a matter of course, and then die as a matter of course. How lonely. ... Title drop. It's incredible. And that is when we talk about the series kind of leaving you on a lingering note. That's it, right?
Yes. Because also then, like, this Shiki, to add to the dreamlike quality, right? This Shiki seems to, like, fade away between cuts.
Right.
And is just gone. You don't see her walk away. There are no footprints left in the snow. There's a really, because throughout that, there's also this very unsettling thing. It's almost like an Evil Dead kind of shot where there's like this gust of wind is blowing through the snow and the camera is like from the point of view of the gust of wind, and it's like intercut with Kokuto and Shiki standing there, and it cuts between those two things multiple times until Kokuto turns, looks at it, it blows through, knocks the umbrella out of his hand, the umbrella goes flying out of the city, Shiki is gone. And then the last shot over the ending credits is like the last thing that happens is the credits show the city with like the sky and the orange and the snow is the black umbrella floating through the sky. That's like all of that is this very like kind of just, it's like disturbing in this weird way. There's something incredibly unsettling, I think, about how this ends, where we know, and partially because, you know, we have like the future gospel thing where you see a vision of, well, we don't get Kokuto specifically, we know broadly what happens, that he stays with Shiki, they have a family, all this kind of stuff, that, you know, there is something still haunting this about this idea that he will always be alone in this like fundamental way, because he's not ever trying to reach out of himself. He's never trying to be something special. He's never trying to be something extraordinary. He has accepted it, as it says here, as a matter of course, what his life is. And it's like, and he just accepts it, which is like an unnatural thing. And that is, all this echoes so much the flashback we see in Oblivion Record with Asuka and her sort of primordial memory of Kokuto and her recognizing this exact thing that Shiki is talking about here. Asuka like understands it instinctually and is part of what like gives her this drive to try to like protect, like love her brother, but like to protect him in some way, because she sees how like kind of horrifying this lifestyle is to her, even if for Kokuto's own subjective experience, I don't think he has a problem with it. He's perfectly happy being what he is. But to everybody else, it's like kind of it's horrifying. There's a line earlier where she says it's like it's the shape of a mind that like I can't even touch this Shiki. Like it's like something that is almost inhuman, so special I can't even touch it, is what she says, like what he is. It's a very provocative idea, I think.
Extremely provocative, extremely memorable. Yeah, it's this series is so good, Sean. This is so good. I mean, we've spent a fucking hour just on the epilogue, and yeah, this is one of the richest pieces of writing and, as we were talking about earlier, production in this entire project, and that's saying something. And I'm so glad this exists and that they animated this and that they animated this in the form they did it, because it is absolutely essential. The rest of the stuff we're talking about today, especially Future Gospel, is also very good, and I'm very glad it exists. I wouldn't call it essential in the same way as this, just because it is essential. It is in essence an extra. This is not that. This is something you gotta watch.
Yes, but also it is one where like I'm glad that they got to do it, because obviously it's the thing that in adapting this story into a movie, there's no other way you could do this. Like, you couldn't attach this to the end of one of the movies. It would be the most bizarre fucking thing imaginable if you just stuck either you'd have to try to crush it down, which would ruin it, or you have to just do the full thing, but you can't do this. This is such a novelistic idea. Like, you couldn't possibly put this at the end of the last movie. So
the longest post-credits scene ever.
Yes, oh my god.
We get the Kalafina song, we get Seventh Heaven, it's great, it's awesome, and then fade back in on the Orange Knight, and there's a 33-minute post-credits scene. That actually, I would kind of enjoy that. That'd be great.
That would be amazing. Oh my god, that would be fucking wonderful. But yes.
That would also make movie 7 like 2 hours and 40 minutes long.
Yeah, yes. I would have fucking sat through the whole thing. Everybody else would have left the movie theater. I'm like, I'm fucking staying through this shit. Oh my god.
That would be the best end credits scene ever. I would love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Anything else to say about the epilogue, or should we move on to Mirai Fukuin?
Yes, let's talk about the Future Gospel. So again, this is an adaptation of an additional 2 chapters that Nasu wrote in 2008. One like fun anecdote about that is Type Moon actually had been banned from Comiket for after Fate's Day Night came out, because the lines for Fate's Day Night were so long that they were like, you guys can't be here anymore. So to sell this, Nasu and Takeuchi actually like they restarted up their old like doujinshi name of the Bamboo Broom, which was the name of their blog that they originally published chapters on. So they went to Comiket, just like the 2 of them as that group, to self-publish this little thing in 2008. Obviously, it then later got picked up in 2011. It got officially published by Seikaisha, not Kodansha. So that's why on Mirai Fukuin, you get Seikaisha's logo on it as well as Kodansha's logo. So it got picked up by a different publisher in 2011. So, part of like, I think the thing to understand about Future Gospel then is that it was fundamentally written after these movies started coming out. So it is part of like the resurgence, right? I can't imagine he would have written this if it wasn't for the fact that these movies had exploded people's interest in this series. Like Cardinal Kyoukai was a thing that he wrote in 1998. And then would get occasional like new volume releases once it got published and stuff. But it didn't have like a huge demand until these movies were very popular, and so it created this huge demand. And then he made this new thing with Takeichi, who again, he wrote those 3 manga spin-off things that are what constitute extra chorus. So this was then written also fundamentally as part of the 10th anniversary of the original release of the final chapter of Kata no Kyoukai. And so all of it is, I think the nature of the story is written with all that stuff in mind, right? It is a story that is about the future, but all the stuff about the future is from characters that exist in 1998, and then the present day stuff, I think, is set in 2010. I believe it was originally 2008 in the original version of the novel, and then I think it was updated then later. But so it is about this like sense of the time that has passed. It's almost like its own version of the kind of legacy sequel thing that we have these days with Force Awakens and Top Gun Maverick and all that kind of stuff. And it's just like, it's a very interesting experience to have that kind of legacy sequel adapted, but more or less within the same time frame of the original things being adapted. And so there's this whole weird web of Kata no Kyoukai and influences and the popularity of the series and stuff that come into this thing being made in the first place.
There's also something, this might sound stupid, but also in that intervening time, Kinoko Nasu has become the world's foremost writer of visual novels. And there's something about Future Gospel where I can just fucking see in my mind's eye the visual novel version of this one in a way I can't with the other episodes. I don't know what it is, but there was something about, like, the first big scene of this one is you have the new character Shizune, who is like, is the one who can see the future. And she's on the train, she foresees this death of this man, she stops him, the man kind of accosts her, then Kokuto comes in, this is how they meet, and then they go have a conversation in a cafe, and that's that side of the first half of this movie. I can see the visual novel version of that so fucking plainly in my mind's eye. I can see, like, the text of her on the train, and, like, the text kind of coming down and explaining, like, her feelings, and then, like, I can see the, like, flash animation that would come up showing, like, oh no, this is the death that she sees, and then I can see, like, Kokuto's character portrait coming in and talking to her. There's something about that where I'm like, oh, the shape of this feels, it's a slight difference, but there's just something about that I didn't ever feel watching Garden of Sinners, where I'm like, oh, I can see the visual novel version of this one specifically very easily.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good... I hadn't, like, picked up on that, but I think that is there, particularly in the Kokuto side of things, especially because then they go to the cafe, and they're sitting in the cafe, and that is, like, the most... like dating sim visual novel-ass thing ever. It's like, oh, here's the cafe location where, every once in a while characters will meet up and you have that background CG element and stuff, or like CG is the visual novel term for the images they have. It's not like, not 3D CG is not what I mean when I say CG in that context. But yeah, you have like that, and you have maybe like the Kokuto little, like, a 2D image bounce up and down or whatever when it's talking. I can definitely see what you're picking up there. But although I don't think it's not really there, I think in the Shiki side feels very Kata no Kyoukai, it's very actiony. But certainly for the Kokuto side of the story, partially because from Shizune's perspective, it is, it's like an otome game, right? It's her. She's a female main character who is going to the city. She's the one who has the special power. That the main character in the visual novel thing is always the person who has, like, whatever the special power is. In Tsukihime, that Shiki, who is a guy, is the guy who has the mystic eyes of death perception, for instance. And then she encounters the handsome young man who rescues her and, like, mysteriously knows a lot about what her special powers are. All of that is super fucking dating sim, otome game stuff. So yes, I
can just imagine the, like, entire, because you're right, the Shiki side is very, like, pure Kara no Kyoukai goodness, but there's something about the Shizune side where I can see it, like, if Garden of Sinners were somehow a visual novel, I don't know how that would really work given the content of the series in a lot of places, but if it were, I can see the Shizune thing being like, in the little archive section, here's the extra book you take off the shelf and, like, read the Shizune scenario, and that's it. And I don't know, there's just, again, I am reading Witch on the Holy Night right now, but I actually hadn't started when I watched this for the first time, so it was just something in my head kind of got me there. But no, this is great. I want to say, even though I said, like, this isn't essential, this is still, like, one of my favorite Kara no Kyoukai things. I think especially the, like, part in 1998 is so friggin' juicy and good, and there is something about, as much as there are some of the different cases over the course of Kara no Kyokai. One thing we actually don't see a lot of in the main 7 is Koto and Shiki specifically, sort of without Toko's help, kind of working a case themselves, and I do like that in this one. Like, Toko is there in one major scene to help explain some of the precognition stuff, but she's hanging out at the office. Meanwhile, you have Koto dealing with Shizune, and you have Shiki working with the serial bomber person. And I just kind of like watching them both sort of work the case and go through it and see how far they've both come. You have Koto basically becoming... You see how much of an apprentice to Toko he is intellectually in this one, all of that. And then I think the connection, the kind of like legacy sequel part, and seeing how the serial bomber becomes the nanny character basically is all very fun and interesting. It's just, it's a really good time. And it's just so light on its feet. It's so well produced. You can tell everyone involved in this movie is enjoying making it. It's a blast.
Yeah, I think the movie that this reminds me the most of is Oblivion Record. It's kind of like that one. It's like, oh, you just get to have a fun time. Like it's well, let's get the gang back together and do one big thing. Even though, it hadn't been like a decade since the last movie, like it was when the chapter came out. It was 4 years. So, it was like a decent gap between the last movie and this one. So there is still, from that perspective, a bit of let's get the gang back together. Let's do one more of these things. Let's have a good time with it. One thing to point out here about the director, Asuda Tomonori, is we will talk about him again when we get to Heaven's Feel, because the director of this is the same director for all 3 of the Heaven's Feel movies. I think this was the first movie that he had directed, so he kind of came in with this. This is the same writer doing the adaptation as well for both of those. So in some ways, it's a very similar kind of creative team that does this, that when we get to the Heaven's Feel movies later, do those as well. But yeah, there's just a core sort of competence and just sort of passion and joy for the material that I think you feel in this. And I think that comes through both in the anime production, and I think it comes through in the writing for Nasu as well. Like, I think there's a sense of him having fun writing new stuff for these characters again, after everybody loves them, right? And I think that's why it has a much more sort of more positive overall ending point and stuff like that than the epilogue has. Is I think a little bit of this we want to have fun getting back into the world of Kara no Kyokai. And I think that's very much kind of the point of the project. Not to say that it's there aren't interesting things and there's not juicy material here, but I think like Oblivion Record, its main objective is for you to enjoy this world, enjoy these characters, and have fun with this. And its main objective isn't for you to have a fucking existential crisis thinking about the nature of personalities or something.
Yes, although I like this one even more than Oblivion Recording, because I do think it gets into some even more interesting ideas. That's not me putting down Oblivion Recording. I just think the stuff about precognition in this one. This features one of my absolute favorite Toko scenes in the entire fucking series. One, because she is smoking during that scene, and it is the most luscious animation of a character smoking I have ever seen in anime. The fucking detail on her smoking is unbelievable. But the entire whole idea of what precognition is, and these 2 versions of it, precognition, prediction and calculation, and what are the differences, and we've got these 2 characters, and the way those 2 stories are mirrored, it's just so fucking juicy. It's so good. I think the Shizune stuff is my favorite stuff in this movie. It's such a good, contained story. I love that it never ultimately kind of connects to the other half, other than thematically, I think is actually a strength of this movie. But then I also think the stuff about the bomber is super interesting, and Shiki does some badass stuff, and the way that all comes together. It's just, God, I love this. It's the popcorn movie of Kara no Kyokai for me, but it still includes all the kind of intellectual stuff I love to see as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it has the benefit of being, this is just, in terms of our watch order of stuff from a ufotable perspective, we are obviously jumping a bit forward in the future because this is 2013. So you also get to enjoy the enhanced budget and production staff and stuff that ufotable has available, because there are some shots and sequences. This doesn't have the craziest action in Kara no Kyokai, but some of the stuff in the parking garage, the opening scene of the movie, where the Mitsuru character, Ishida Akira's character, the bomber guy, has his vision of how he's going to kill Shiki, which of course then when we revisit that scene, she breaks that fate. All the stuff in that parking garage is one of the best 3D sets that they have made, and there's a bunch of great ufotable ass like big.
They
3D
do a
sweeping
full
camera
Matrix
shots.
bullet time at the beginning
Yes.
of this movie, which I fucking loved. Which is a crazy thing to do in animation, but it's ufotable, so of course they're going to do it. It's great.
Yeah, and it's just you get the like really nice. Obviously, the whole series has had incredibly good production values and has been very well animated. But this movie looks more expensive to me because I'm sure it was in terms of, at least from like the staff. Like ufotable is a much bigger studio by 2013 than it is in 2007. You know?
Oh, exactly. And although what's funny is that 2009 to 2013, that is such a expansive period in anime. If you look at like what stuff looks like before the turnover to 2010s and then like mid 2010s, I mean, that is a rapid period of development, I think it would be safe to say. And this definitely is like rapidly developed. Although because ufotable starts from such a fucking head start over everyone else, not as much as I think if you looked at some other studios in that period. That is not a criticism of this. That is saying they were already at such an advantage on some of how they're like integrating CG and stuff that they had less of a jump just to make,
Yeah, but yes, I agree with that. There is this sense of like there's almost something disappointing to me in this like kind of good way going back to this movie, because in my memory this movie was like looked mind-blowingly good when I originally watched it. But I also originally watched it slight of like later than I did the other Kinoko Kyoukai movies, partially because it was kind of a pain in the ass like 5+ years ago to actually watch these movies in English because the Blu-ray releases are like impossible to get. But I just remember when I watched it, whenever that would have been like in 2014 or something like that, being like, oh my God, look at this movie. And now it's like, it looks awesome. But I'm like, yeah, this looks like a ufotable movie. Whereas like at the time compared to other stuff, it's like, holy shit, oh my God. Like I remember my mind just fucking exploding at how cool all the shit in the parking garage looked. Because, particularly before you have stuff like Kimetsu no Yaiba being on goddamn TV, like you just didn't have a lot of stuff that looked like that back then. And so it was like really shocking how well that 2D, 3D stuff was integrated in some of those 3D camera moves.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, you can imagine this being such a crowd pleaser in theaters and getting the audience cheering. And then I remember Japanese audiences do not cheer in movies. But if they did, this would be a movie to do that in, because it is like, can you imagine being a Japanese fan of these and like 4 years later you get to go back to a theater for a 90-minute movie? And this is one of the more, I feel like, movie-shaped films in the series. It feels like, this is a 90-minute movie that's that would be so fun to go see in a theater. Yeah, but let's focus in on those sort of two stories we get in the first half. Particularly, I just think that the Shizune Seo story, that character voiced by Yuka Iguchi, is such a fun character. It's such an interesting story. I love that it stays so down to earth, because the way it is these two parallel stories, and I think when I was first watching this, I was like, oh, well, obviously what's going to happen is that we've got these two characters who are seeing the future, and so Kokuto is going to somehow get Shizune to help Shiki find the bomber, and like these are going to intersect, and they never do. And I actually really like that, because it keeps it in the realm of sort of this thematic connection instead of a literal one. And it also means you could very easily kind of cut out, re-edit that Shizune story, and it's just this story about this girl who is struggling with this ability she has. She has this encounter with this interesting, cute boy who kind of helps her come to terms with it kind of mentally, and then she goes back to school. And it's this very like slice of life about someone who has this extraordinary power. And it's sometimes funny, it's sometimes sad. There's this whole scene about her and this dog she had at home. The scene about Chris the dog, that culminates in one of, I think, the absolute most gut punch lines Kinoko Nasu has ever written, which is, compared to other people, I'm forced to carry one extra load of sorrow, and he understood how I felt without hearing me put it into words. And I wrote in my notes, Jesus fucking Christ, how are you doing this to us? In this scene about Chris the dog who dies, but stays around long enough for her to see him one last time. And you go from that, but then you also go to these highs of like in the cafe, and it's kind of cute and funny with her ordering like the orange pie and all of that. And it's just such a good character story that has these super interesting implications, because I love the entire explanation of what precognition is in this universe.
Yeah, it's all really good. Like, one thing that's also fun with it is it does hook into a couple of things that, because of the order in which these stories were written versus the movies coming out, Shizune was actually set up a little bit in the movies, because she pops up at the very, very end of Oblivion Record because it's her the dog in that, if you remember the incredibly cute dog in movie 6, that's her dog, right? Because she left for whatever vacation that was while Asuka and Shiki were in the dorms investigating all that stuff. And so Shizune pops up at the very end of that movie because they knew, I think at that point, they were like, we'll probably eventually adapt this new thing that Nasu wrote because that was out by that point that movie 6 came out. So they like put that in. There's a brief reference to her at the very end of movie 7 where they mention like something that girl predicted all those years ago. That is her saying that like, oh, you will die, you know, if you keep on dating her, like you will die one day. To Kokuto, and so that's very briefly referenced. So that's one thing that's fun is they did briefly seed Shizune a little bit, because I do like, you know, she hooks into that whole side of the world. She hooks into the Asuka stuff. She hooks into the Reian Academy and all that. And I love being able to sort of revisit some of those locations. The ending of her story being the first time she meets Asuka, who's the little sister of the boy she now has a crush on. Yeah, all that stuff is really fun. Yeah, it's kind of like movie 6. It's got that whole kind of otome game, like female-led kind of romance story thing. It's got the, you know, Shizune is such a different character than Shiki or Kokuto, and so kind of like Asuka just gives us a different perspective on things in this world. But I would agree that for me, the big standout sequence is that flashback of the dog, because I think it really creates a very relatable way to sort of connect to how Shizune experiences her precognition. I think one thing that's really effective about it is that, you know, when she first comes back home, she sees her dog dead and it's like lying outside its doghouse. And then she kind of like comes back to herself and sees the dog's alive and she realizes she had the vision. Then the next day she comes out and the dog has died, but it's like underneath the porch or whatever. And so it's like things are not happening exactly the way that she predicts it. And that's part of what it's talking about with like precognition, is what it is someone being able to subconsciously be able to, on looking at and like seeing a situation, like inputting like whatever the data is subconsciously into their head and being able to predict with like incredible accuracy what is going to happen. And they're just not like aware of that. They're not aware of any of those things going on. And one thing that's interesting is it reminded me of an anecdote from Orson Welles, actually, of all people, in an interview, like obviously a super old interview with him, talking about psychics and how, you know, he would like doing magic tricks and stuff like that. And he got into the whole world to disprove people and like that, like, you know, obviously psychics are bullshit in the real world and all that kind of stuff. And what they do is like cold reading. And what they do is seeing like information and drawing like informed conclusions about people and giving like just enough of a informed conclusion about something to get people to buy into whatever they're doing. That's what a cold read is. But that he describes the like, a thing that can happen to people in that profession is when you get good enough at it, you start doing it without thinking about it. And so you start making these informed guesses that can be shockingly right, but you're not actively aware of all the things that you observed because you've been doing it enough. And that one time he like made he guessed that this like woman's husband died. I forget what the specific thing was, but something like that, like a really specific tragedy had occurred and he had guessed it. And it freaked him out, but he realized, like, of course, he had seen stuff, he had seen signs, and he just wasn't aware of it. And so, without being aware of it, it makes you feel like you have a supernatural ability, and that's basically what this is describing with Shizune.
Yes, because Toko gives us the whole explanation in the scene, like I said, where she's smoking. It's very luscious animation. She is also playing a Game Boy, and I love how loving the animation. It's very clearly a Game Boy Pocket, because this is 98. That is the Game Boy they have drawn her playing. It's in anime, when they're doing a Game Boy, it's usually like a very simple, a screen and like a D-pad and two buttons to kind of signify Game Boy. But this is ufotable, so they went fucking full hog and made it very clearly a fully modeled Game Boy Pocket. But anyway, she's playing all of that, and she's explaining it's this high-level information processing where you don't forget anything, you acquire all this information, and then it allows you to see the outcome, which of course makes total in that Toko sense, makes like such brutal, cold logic when you think about it, of like, yes, if you were able to know and calculate everything, you would be able to effectively see the future in that way. And so Shizune is just actually very observant. One of the little things in this is I love, she had been the top student in her class until recently, because she could predict the test answers, and then she kind of pulled back off of that. And when I first saw that detail, I went, oh my god, this is funny, because that is exactly what Anya Forger tries to do in Spy Family. The joke is that she always fails, even though she has the ability to read minds. She still fucks up the tests, but she can do that. And I was like, oh my god, this is like Anya Forger. But the joke, or the punchline here, is that no, she's actually a really smart student. That's not her cheating at all. She is actually using her just natural talents. And it's such an interesting idea.
Yeah, and I like the whole process by which it gets explained, and then like Kokuto doing his own version of it, right, by like writing on the card, and he gets it like mostly right because he obviously like subconsciously influences her to want to order that cake or whatever. Yeah, it's just like a very thoughtful like exploration of this idea of what, in like a more grounded sense, the ability of precognition might be for someone like Shizune, who is like, you know, extraordinary, but probably not really magical, you know?
Right. Yeah, because the other type, the calculation type, is what... sorry, I'm getting these mixed up. I did write it down here for myself. In other words, calculation accumulates the future, whereas prediction reads the future. Shizune is the prediction type. The calculation type is the other person, the serial bomber, who has literal magical eyes, where like one eye sees the future and the other eye sees what he has to do to make that future happen. So he's literally willing the future into existence by doing the steps that are sort of required. And the whole explanation there of how that then creates a literal entity that Shiki is able to cut is one of my favorite fucking Shiki moments in this entire series. It's so cool.
Yeah, all that stuff is amazing. I love the Mitsuru character, or like he's called Meduka, which is a really weird name. It's just written in katakana. I looked it up because I was curious. Like, is that in kanji? Like, what the fuck is Meduka?
Yeah,
I have no idea where that name. I don't know where it comes from. That's the name he has when he's the serial bomber, and then in the like epilogue or whatever, the future, he has a different name, Mitsuru. It's the Ishida Akira character, which is a really good actor to get.
I loved that's another reason I love this movie, is just I will take Ishida Akira in anything. He's one of my favorites. We've talked about him many times in Gundam and in Persona and all sorts of things, but yeah.
Yes. So very good actor to get in here playing this character. And yeah, I love the whole explanation of like this other version of quote unquote predicting the future, which isn't necessarily like predicting the future as in like being able to read the future and be like, oh, I can, you know, it's not Nostradamus or whatever, like having a prediction of 1,000 years from now, like the pyramids will turn into aliens or whatever the fuck that dude said. Instead, it's like, oh, I can anticipate like what the consequences of these things are going to be, to a very exacting detail, and then be able to, it's like the calculation thing, like he sees it as an equation. It's like you just fill in the numbers and then it solves itself. It's like he knows exactly what to do to get those exact outcomes, but to the point where he effectively becomes a slave to that thing, right? He becomes a slave to the calculation that he is seeing it, and so he feels compelled to have to fill it in and complete it. There's something interesting about that, of like he's so trapped by this weird future that technically he doesn't have to do, but he has built this weird momentum by which he has to keep on doing it. So he's like, he doesn't have to create the future that he is seeing, but he is compelled to do so. And I think that that's a really interesting idea. But that, yes, the big fucking amazing moment is the final encounter between him and Shiki, and her having the line that like, you know, the future is unbeatable because it's unknowable, because it doesn't exist. But if you give shape to it, of course it can be broken. And that's such a badass Shiki line to have after she like literally cuts the future, cuts the death lines of the future this guy is trying to make, and fucking destroys his eye. Yeah, that scene is, as you say, that is the, like, if you were going to like applaud and stand up and like hoot and shout in the movie theater, it is that moment, because it is so fucking cool.
It's so good. I am also now down a rabbit hole of looking at, this is a complete non sequitur, but I'm looking at Akira Ishida's credits, and he hasn't done like a crazy amount of dubbing for live action movies, but some of the ones he's done that I now really want to see, he voiced the Riddler in the new Batman movie, the Paul Dano character. That's amazing. That's just a great piece of casting. He is Luke Skywalker in the special edition of Star Wars Episode 4, which is hilarious to me. And then the one that I now need to track down and see is that in the 2003 NTV airing of Titanic, he voiced Jack, the Leonardo DiCaprio character. And the idea of Ishida Akira as Jack from Titanic makes me laugh extremely hard, and I want to find that now.
Yeah, it's also it's Athranzala era Ishida Akira too.
It's so good. Anyway, I'm sorry. Sometimes I go down these rabbit holes and they're hilarious. But he really is one of my favorite actors, and I love him here. And yeah, but as you say, Shiki can cut the future because he's given shape to it. Yeah, that is probably the most creative use of the mystic eyes of death perception in this series, and I love it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And just all the serial bomber plot, like the whole steps to solving it, like. It's so fucking cool. It's also where you get some of the coolest animation, like the bridge blowing up and Shiki like getting thrown up into the sky. I love the detail in that moment where she throws the phone clear onto the bank before she falls into the river so that the phone doesn't get wet, just so she can fucking like taunt the dude after she gets out, because that's the only thing she does with the phone. She gets up and says, just she looks in exactly his direction because she's figured out like the lines of sight or whatever. It's like, now I know exactly where you are, and looks right at him, and then she destroys the phone. And I love that that's the only reason she kept the phone, because she destroys it immediately afterwards.
That's something we don't get a ton in like the final half of Kara no Kyoukai, but in the beginning you get a lot of is just Shiki has a fucking attitude, and I love when she's going after the bad guys, just she has this fucking attitude, and it's so good because she's having fun with it, and it's so entertaining to watch. Yeah, I love that. Here's a little moment I love is that Mikia gives Shizune a Garan no Do a business card, the hollow shrine. The idea, and it just says Garan no Do staff, Mikia Kokuto. The idea that, I don't know, did he make the business cards? Does Toko make herself and her employees business cards of this fucking weird, maybe detective agency? Do they get payments? I have no idea. It's just, I love the idea of there being Garan no Do business cards and Kokuto taking them around is very funny to me.
Yeah, well, that also leads to what is like low-key, I think, one of the funniest pieces of dialogue in this whole series, which is Shizune asks Kokuto for the business card that he wrote the thing down on, obviously because she has a massive crush on him, but he doesn't get it. I mean, it's like, why would you want a business card? Like, I don't think you'd have any use for my business card. But then he says to himself, well, I guess that's what business cards are anyways. Like, business cards are fucking pointless. Like, you just give them to people and they don't do anything with it. And it's just like a fun little bit of social commentary that fucking Kokuto gives us here in this whole scene. He just like basically like whispers it under his breath to himself, and I found it very funny.
Do you think students, like kids today of the age you and I teach, know what business cards are anymore?
Oh God, I don't think so. I mean, it has been a long time since I got a business card from anybody. Like, I feel like you don't. It is the kind of an older concept. I know that it is a thing that like Japan has its whole. There's an entire subquest in Yakuza 0 that's all about learning the proper manners for giving and receiving of business cards. So I know
that was in our textbook. That was like an exercise in our Japanese textbook. No, it's a huge thing in Japan, yeah. So it makes, I mean, that's why it's extra funny in this setting, is that Garan no Do would be such an aggressively weird organization, but Toko would still make the business cards. But yes, I'm just thinking in an American context, that is a relic, definitely. Yeah. But it is.
I do like the mental image of Toko having to do the thing where it's like, okay, you hold the business card on like both corners with both hands and proffer it forward and bow your head a little bit, and you got to make sure when you take the other person's business card, you got to look at it very carefully. It's like all like the whole procedure you have to do. I like to imagine Toko having to try to do that.
Yes,
because it's not exactly her style.
Thomas worked in a Japanese office for my brother. I need to ask him if he ever like ran into the business card scenario and had to do it. That'd be hilarious. But anyway, we're getting off topic, but it is a very funny moment in this film. Should we talk about the second half where we go into the future and see the time after the series?
Yeah, so, obviously like a big whole thing with this, like seeing the future stuff that you're getting in the first half of the movie is all, I think, like to set up conceptually what is happening here, which is like that you can't predict the future. Like, I like that, like the future predicting powers are basically broken by the time you get to 2010. Like, Shizune doesn't really have it, right? She's got an ability to anticipate things with alarming accuracy, but she doesn't have a magical power to see the future. Mitsuru's ability to see the future is broken. There is this older woman voiced by Kujira, Mifune's mother, Mifune being the name of the city, who is this like weird fortune teller lady in the back alley. Kujira, by the way, low-key one of my favorite Japanese voice actors.
I love her.
She's Orochimaru in Naruto, amongst many other roles. But it's like, if you need like a cool but kind of creepy old lady, or old snake man in the case of Orochimaru, she's just very fucking good at that.
And I love her here. That character who does appear in both halves, because we get a visit from Shiki to her in the first half, and then we get this here. It's just her scenes are fantastic. They're dynamite.
Yeah, and we learn that she has also lost the ability to see the future. And there's something I like about that. It kind of like puts into perspective the very nostalgic quality, I think very intentionally, that the first half of the movie has. That it's like, this is the first time where Kara no Kyoukai is intentionally being a period piece set in the late 90s, rather than when you're watching the movies feeling like a period piece set in the late 90s, because of course it's adapting a thing much later that was set when it was originally written. So it's like, the books are not a period piece, but when you make movies 10 years later, and you're not updating the setting at all, it ends up having this weird period piece thing that we've talked about sometimes on this podcast. And here now it's clear, oh, that's like an intentional effect now. Like, we have intentionally made this feel like the nostalgic past, and then now we have come to this future where anything past this future now feels uncertain. Because of course, for us, what happened between 1998 and 2010, well, that is a perfectly predictable future, because it actually happened. Because that, for us, is the past. But now we are at what should be really like an unchanging present, is what it feels like this section is supposed to be. And that's like, whatever happens next is unpredictable. And that is one of the most Kara no Kyoukai things about the structure of this movie to me, is that it moves you to this place of like weird, ominous uncertainty about where things are going to go from here, because now the ability to see the future for everybody seems to have been broken. But aside from like, that's the whole kind of like big setting thing that happens in the second half. But you also you hook back up with Mitsuru, now the Ishida Akira character who has fallen on hard times. And then you meet a very important character, which is Mana, who is voiced by Squid Girl herself, Hisako Kanemoto, or Nilo from Genshin Impact, if you play Genshin as well. Great voice actress. Mana, of course, we learn, is the daughter of Shiki and Kokuto. And there's something about this combo of the like former magical, like the guy who used to be able to see the future and use that power to commit crimes, who has lost that power and fallen on hard times, like having to like going around and investigating crimes for this like Yakuza group with the like precocious daughter of the Yakuza boss lady, who was also the woman who broke his ability to see the future. Like, that's its own fucking TV show.
Yes,
like, that's such a great setup, and it's like you get this one little like 30-minute section of it. I'm like, they should have their own fucking TV show. Like, it's so good.
Yeah, if ufotable ever wants to make Kara no Kyoukai the next generation starring these two, I would watch the absolute shit out of that. I am also fascinated by fucking Shiki basically leading the fucking Yakuza and having a like shakedown on this guy. I guess that makes sense, but it is very funny to just watch Shiki like walk in, and I half expect her to like put the fucking knife down and be like, "You're giving me a pinky for this money."
Yeah, well, the Rogi family always was this like weird like occult Yakuza group or whatever. So she has gone back. She has become the head of the Rogi family. One detail that you don't hear about in the movie, but I know is that I love, because it's just perfect, is that Kokuto is not Kokuto anymore. He's Mikiya Ryogi, because he married into the Ryogi family, not the other way around. Right. So he took her last name, which I love. But yes, you just get like these little hints of what the future has held for Shiki. Again, you don't actually even see Mikiya, although you get little things about him. I love that Mana has this very Asuka attitude. She has this incredibly funny line about like, my dream is to defeat my mother and win back my dad. One of the funniest lines in any Kara no Kyoukai thing.
Yeah, I wrote it down here. My goal is to defeat mother someday and win back daddy. It's so good, yeah.
Yeah.
It's very cute. But they're such a good team. Even in this like little 30-minute segment, those two characters, Mana and Mitsuru, are such a good little team. Mana has such a great personality. The character design on Mana is just perfect in terms of combining Koto and Shiki. All of it is a blast.
Yeah, and I think it's like really smart and was the right move to do this thing where it's like, well, let's get something set in the future, but let's only give you a little taste of our old main characters. And instead, it's about these two basically new people, right? We met Mitsuru, but we only met him in this story. So he's effectively a new character still. And then Mana is the daughter of characters that we know, but she is a new character. And I like that. I like that it's like, it's part of that sort of like the uncertainty that you get here. I think you would feel like too good to just be able to spend time with this like grown-up Shiki and Mikia that are married and have this like wonderful life together or whatever that I like to imagine that they have, and you are given the space to imagine that is happening, but that's not what this story is. It's about these two people and about like a very different future for the world or whatever, like this uncertainty about like what could happen next.
Yes, absolutely. It also makes sense that they have one child and no more, because I can very easily imagine Shiki being like, we're done with that. We have the one. We have Mana. That's enough.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I also like that Mana, her characterization, I think, is like very intentionally Asuka-esque, because it like I have to imagine that Asuka is like the most doting aunt ever. Right? Like she just must go over all the time, and because it feels like she has rubbed off on Mana incredibly, because it's like she has the whole kind of precocious thing that Asuka had, and I think it feels very intentional that she's echoing some of that character.
Yes. No, it's great. This little mystery they go on together, I like that it brings them back to Mother of Mifune, and we basically have sort of these three interconnected scenes with the Mother of Mifune. We have Shiki in 98 running into her, we have Mana and Mitsuru running into her here, and I like that Mother of Mifune and Mitsuru have this like old like little rivalry going on, where like she knows him as this fucking punk kid, and he knows there's this like old hag basically. And then you have the final flashback in the movie, which goes back to January 1996, right before male Shiki dies in episode 2, at the end of episode 2, and has this final run in. And this is where I may be slightly more just a little tiny more mixed, is I think I really like this scene overall. I like the idea that male Shiki is thinking about suicide, which we knew he was ahead of time, because he's thinking the other Shiki could live a better life without him. But he runs into the Mother of Mifune, and she gives him this like very nihilistic response of like, yep, you're gonna die, there's nothing else out there, you're gonna die no matter what. But then this last line, your dreams will live on. I like all of that. I do think they maybe ham it up is the wrong word. I think they lay it on a little thick, and like just the final moments of like the final look back and all of that feels a little laid on thick to me. But otherwise, I do like this as an idea.
I don't know. I don't even really feel the laid on thick thing. I really like this. I think partially because it's like we just have not seen male Shiki in such a long time, and it is like the beginning of everything, right? Is the loss of this personality is what sets in many ways everything into motion. I mean, it's essential for the Shiki we know to become what she is, right? The death of this Shiki is what awakens her to the mystic eyes of death perception and all of that stuff. You know, we also get here what I think this is now the third time where if you are watching this on Crunchyroll, you do get a brief singing in the rain that is cut out on the Crunchyroll version.
I missed it. God damn it. Yeah, I didn't see it that way.
At the very, very end, the rain starts going, and male Shiki starts skipping around. It's like, I think she hums maybe the first half of like the melody. Like it's not even very much singing in the rain. For whatever reason in the Crunchyroll version, just no music plays there at all. It's the least amount of singing in the rain there has been in the two singing in the rain scenes, and they still, for whatever reason, the Crunchyroll version has it cut out. But that is like...
I'm still confused. There's no fucking way that song is under copyright still. That song is 95 years old, I think, because it's from...
And even if it is, like... Again, she hums like half of the melody. Like this, like whatever copyright wouldn't even protect it from that. Like you could still do that. Like it's very weird. Again, but that's what like actually leads the movie out, is her skipping, or leads the movie out into the credits. And then there is like a very tiny little post-credit scene of her walking into the bamboo forest and dawn coming up, and that's like the very, very end of the movie.
I don't dislike it. It felt maybe a little discordant to me, but not in a way that ruins anything for me. I love it. I overall, I like all of that. Probably if I had actually heard the Singin' in the Rain with it, because I loved that so much in the other movies, I would have like stood up cheering. So maybe that's it. Maybe just something was missing for me because I watched the Crunchyroll version, because I was watching this one on my TV, so I just put it up on Crunchyroll. But yeah, I still think it's a good scene. I think it's a great use of the Mother of Mifune character, and the like Shiki hears what would be bad news to most people, but then this little nugget that is the thing he actually needs to kind of go through with it, I think is interesting. It's always a dangerous thing to do what is sort of technically a retcon or kind of adding into the past of a story, but it's done very masterfully here, like everything else.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I like about how it's handled here is that, the movie is very subtly building up to this moment, right? Because in both of the Mother Mifune scenes previous, there are lines that set up that this is going to happen, because Mother Mifune recognizes Shiki, but Shiki doesn't remember her. And that's, of course, because she has lost the memories that the male Shiki had, so she does not remember that encounter. And then my favorite line setting it up is that Mana, in their meeting with Mother Mifune, mentions that it's like, there's like, Mother Mifune is thanking her for helping her. And then Mana says, it's like, no, of course, because you helped out my mother. I mean, you helped out my father. And at the time, you're meant to interpret that line as meaning Kokuto. And then you get that further flashback. It's like, oh, she's talking about this male Shiki. And I like the idea that Mana knows that other Shiki existed. There's something I find very touching about that idea that she thinks of that male Shiki as being her father, or one of her fathers, however you would phrase that. There's something very touching about that whole construction. And I like that if you're going to have this extra little thing, which is what this movie kind of is, this extra note on the series, there is something appropriate to me about let's spend a little bit of that time looking back at this, who is the only major character death in the whole thing, is that male Shiki, unless you count the one time that Toko died. That would be the other major character death, but that's complicated to talk about. But that male Shiki died and is dead, and there's something appropriate about sort of spending a little bit of time reflecting on how important that character was, if you're going to have this extra little note.
It feels like the right place to bring it back together and end it, because definitely, this is another one where you do not want to take Future Gospel and somehow insert it into the chronology of the series or something. It is very clearly made as part 8, even when it is in the past. It is made very clearly with the knowledge of what is going to happen, because you're getting stuff like the prediction of, the death of Kokuto and stuff like that, and the full context of it as the viewer. And I think, yes, going back to, if you're going to pick adding a new story on, what is the moment we're going to return to kind of end it, leading up to the death of male Shiki does feel right, in terms of that being the pivot point on which the rest of the story opens up, right?
Yeah. Yeah. You also get a really beautiful version of the school theme that plays when you cut to male Shiki going to the alley for the first time. The music across the whole movie is phenomenal, as it is for all of these, but that one in particular was a musical callback that made me shockingly emotional as soon as it happened, because it's such a powerful musical theme that you only hear a couple of times in the whole series of movies. So getting this really beautiful new version of it right there just really puts you in the moment.
The score overall, I think, is a highlight of this one. It's one of the best scored. I think there's something about Yuki Kajiura getting to come back and this is the only one. This is a 90-minute movie to score, new music, old music, but I think the music throughout is just tremendous, including the Kalafina song at the end, Alleluia, basically, is, I think, my favorite of the end songs in this series. I've listened to it a million times. It captures that kind of cool, hopeful tone this movie has. It's just so beautiful to listen to. I adore that song.
Yeah, it is a really good one.
Yeah. So, speaking of songs, I have answered the question of Singin' in the Rain copyright. For everyone confused, why is this an issue? Song copyright in the US is longer than I thought. So this song was written and copyrighted in the year 1929, and for songs copyrighted before 1978, the rule was 95 years from publication date. So Singin' in the Rain will go out of copyright in 2024. We're very close to that, but we're not quite there, and I guess this is why they needed to do this or pay up over on Crunchyroll. And apparently it is a expensive song to copyright. Stanley Kubrick paid $10,000 to do it for A Clockwork Orange back in the day. So there you go.
I should set a reminder on my phone to send an email to Crunchyroll 2 years from now. It's like, replace it. It's time. Replace the version of Garden of Center. Is like the record must be set straight.
Can you imagine what a raving lunatic you would sound like? Just someone at Crunchyroll is drinking their coffee in the morning, like, let's check the emails from the community. This person's going on about the Copyright Act of 1978. What the fuck? God, delete that.
No, it must be changed.
Yes, but anyway, I'm sad it's not there. Still a great movie. What else should we say about Future Gospel?
I feel like we covered it pretty well. It's again, it's like, it's not, you know, again, it's not like, it doesn't fuck with your entire brain the way that the epilogue does. But it is an incredibly good movie. I think it's the way it's constructed around these ideas of the future, predicting the future, then going to that future that is one that, like, nobody predicted or whatever. And there's all these lines that the mother Mifune has about, like, her not being able to see the future anymore, the future being this, like, dark and uncertain thing now because nobody is interested in predicting the future. Like, that seems to be an ability that has been lost or something, which, again, it feels appropriate for a thing that is now set in, like, what for us is effectively the present day. I mean, obviously now it's the distant past. At the time, it was basically the present day. There's something about that is such an evocative idea, how to structure this sort of pseudo-nostalgia piece around the past and the future. It's very smart.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. It's outstanding. I'm glad we got to talk about it here. And then there is, finally, there is Extra Chorus. My favorite thing about Extra Chorus, I do have to say, is that it does give us one last claymation opening.
Yes.
The other two we talked about today do not have it, but the last, and this one is done a little differently because it's just sort of our four main characters in the theater together. The theater is more brightly lit. We see the movie they're watching. It's very cute. Shiki and Kokoto hold hands at the end. But I will say, since we last recorded, Sean, I have gone into a whole mode where I have decided I've created these fun so I'm teaching an intro to film theory class next semester that is already ongoing when this is coming out. But for our screenings, I've created these little pre-show packages where I've got some trailers, like for next week's movie, some other, like, just fun archival trailers, because I found this 35mm archive of movie trailers, some other, like, you know, silence your cell phone things. And then for about half the weeks, because I have 7 or 8 of these, I've been using the Kara no Kyoukai openings as, like, our little, like, right before the movie starts, turn off your phone or other PSAs. And, you know, they get increasingly weird. And I have put this one, the final claymation opening, in for the final week. And I think it's very good. And those are going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully I'll share some of these online because they were fun to put together. And I've got all sorts of, like, theater inserts from, like, AMC in the 90s on 35mm. There's lots of fun stuff you have from that. But I did include the Kara no Kyoukai openings because they are the best I've ever seen for this kind of thing. And I love them.
Yeah, they're very good. And I do like this one, you know, this one feels very appropriate that it's like this one little nod to the series, because obviously they knew at the time that, like, this is going to be the last thing probably they ever do with the series. So it is just like, you know, nobody's doing anything bad. Toka's not, like, smoking in the movie theater. Nobody's got a cell phone or whatever. It's just everyone's sitting there having a good time. And then the card comes up and it's like, hey, like, it's like, behave yourself in the movies, basically. Like, protect the manners at the movies. I think it's like a very...
This is mind your manners and enjoy the film, basically.
Exactly, yes.
I had to translate it because it did not have subtitles for some reason. So I had to go through that, but yes.
Yes. But it's a nice little moment. And then, Extra Chorus, again, these are these, like, 3 little manga chapters that Takashi Takeuchi wrote that were part of that thing they gave away at that 2008 Comic-Cat. So it's like, you know, it's meant to be this, like, little fun extra. So they're not, you know, none of these are very substantial. The middle one is obviously the Asagami Fujino one is, like, the showpiece. That's the only one that is, like, big. And it is nice to, like, see more of that character, get a little bit more with her. But you also have the cat one, which is good for just getting some really good cat animation. I like cats in anime. You know, it's always good. And then you get the third one, the last one, which is Shiki and Kokuto doing their Hatsumode, which is like their first shrine visit of the new year together. And you get this little note that ends everything, and this like nice little note of where it's snowing around Japan, and it like it made me think, even though it's totally different, it made me think of the end of James Joyce's novella The Dead, where the last line of that is like, in snow fall, I forget the exact thing, but something like, and the snow is falling on all of us, both the living and the dead. There it's much more grim, but this idea that like everybody is connected by the weather because it snows on everybody equally. It's a nice little moment, but all these are these kind of little bonus stories to spend a little bit more time with these characters.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to say about any of them. I do like the cat one a lot. I think it's very cute. And I also... Have you ever seen, Sean, Makoto Shinkai? The first movie he ever made was a short film called She and Her Cat. Have you ever seen that?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's this little digital animation. It's the first thing Shinkai made. It's done in black and white, and it's this little story from the perspective of a cat living with like a single woman in her 20s in Japan in an apartment. It's since actually there was someone else did a manga based on it and then got a little OVA animation, but the original is a very good short. It's on one of the Blu-rays of one of Shinkai's early movies now. But I like imagining she and her cat, but it's with Shiki. And so the cat is describing like, she came home covered in blood or whatever else. The cat does not ultimately wind up living with Shiki, although I kind of like the idea of she and her cat, but the she is not like a random college student. It is Shiki. Ryogi is very funny to me.
Yeah, it's like, imagine like the cat trying to describe the ice cream scene from the first movie. It's like, she came home without an arm and she's trying to eat ice cream on the bed. It's like, yeah.
Yeah, no, because that's exactly, it's like these very mundane scenes is the Makoto Shinkai movie, but the mundane scenes for Shiki are a little more gnarly and weird. So, yeah. She came home with this boy who was talking about eating his parents' guts after killing them, and he lived with us for like a year. No, but the cat is okay. It winds up living with Kokuto's family, and all is well with the cat. The poster for this one is great because it's everyone. I think it's the image I have for this episode, so if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see it, of everyone gathered around the cat. It's very cute. It's a very good key art.
Yeah, anime cats, always a good time.
Yep, the rich lineage of anime cats.
Absolutely.
What about the middle section? I didn't get a ton out of it. I felt like it was fine, but didn't add a ton to my understanding of those characters, but it's nice to see them again.
Yeah, I think it just like gives you some closure on some of the stuff from the first movie and the third movie, so like, you get to see a little bit of what has happened to Fujino afterwards. Fujino pops up more a little bit in the novels in the 6th chapter because she is at Rand Academy. Like, it's just like a cameo, but they didn't have that in the movie. I actually, like, in my memory, I had thought that some of the stuff that is here, I remembered that as being part of the 6th movie because I remembered that there was more stuff with Fujino, but I forgot that it was part of the extra chorus thing. So I think in my memory, I inserted it somewhere in the 6th film. But yeah, I think it's just fun to see her again a little bit. You get a little bit again of closure on the first movie with the character in this being someone who was friends with one of the girls who committed suicide / were murdered, depending on how you interpret what happened to them with the ghost lady. It's like not a hugely substantial story, but I think it's one of those things that as a little extra, it's fun to see these characters again for a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, of course, Shrine Visit. Frankly, it's surprising we didn't get that yet because that is an archetypal scenario for any love story in Japan, and we get it here.
Yes, and there's a very funny moment where it's Mikia is talking to Shiki about how, like, eventually you kind of put together what, like, this promise was or whatever, but he went to do this Hatsumode visit with Shiki. He was originally supposed to do it with Asuka, and then he's, like, says it's like, oh, you should have seen, like, the indescribable face that Asuka made when I told her the news, and you get this cut to Asuka with this, like, incredible expression, and then later you see when it's snowing on everyone, you see her, like, yelling furiously.
Yes, I did. That is my favorite part. I loved that.
And it's Shizune and Fujino at Seiin Academy, and they're like, "Oh, she's gonna come here." Or like, was she mad? Yeah, she was really mad.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, I really liked that.
Yeah, so yeah, again, these are just like, it's just like a little fun bonus.
Yes.
You know, anytime getting just to see like some of these characters, particularly characters like Asuka, again, who didn't, you know, Asuka and Fujino didn't pop up a lot in the movies. Getting a little bit of extra stuff with them is a nice bonus.
And yeah, you know, if they do want to make Karno Kyokai The Next Generation starring Mana and Mitsuru, and then you can have Auntie Asuka as the special guest star sometimes, and you could have Fujino, an episode about her, I would watch the shit out of that. They should absolutely do that. The Toko episode would kill. It'd be great.
Oh my god, like, yeah, the day that Toko comes back into town,
Yes.
but of course, like, Mana doesn't know her, and so
Right.
it's like you get maybe like one little scene where at the end Mana's describing what has happened to Mikia or something, and he like, it's like, that person sounds really familiar, but nah, it couldn't be. Yeah, it'd be great.
Ufotable isn't that busy these days. They should do it.
Of course, they're not doing anything
Yeah,
at
they're
all.
not doing anything big, yeah. They got nothing on their plate. Yeah, anyway. What else is there to say? I think we have done Karano Kyokai justice, hopefully, over these 5 episodes. I will say I have a new, one of my favorite animes ever, so that's pretty cool. It's a good start to this season, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, we did also talked a lot of wrap-up kind of stuff when we finished Movie 7 last episode as well, but it's just, oh my god, this series is so good, and it's been so much fun watching it again, because, it is one of those that's like, it's very fun watching it the first time through, but it is also incredibly rewarding on a rewatch, and has been fun to read through some of the book as well. But yeah, it's Karano Kyokai kicks all kinds of ass.
And, you know, just when I have, like, tweeted about this or looked this up online, obviously every goddamn person who has seen or been around this is like, oh, yeah, this is one of the best things ever made. And it is so cool. And this is something that I feel like is so unique to the world of anime, that you could have this is a commercial work. This came out in theaters. This is, you know, go buy it on Blu-ray. It's weird, but it's not like an avant-garde indie thing that is hard to access, right? It's on Crunchyroll now. And it is this smart, and it is this experimental, and it is this daring, and it is this formally adventurous in stuff like Paradox Spiral. And it is like this, you know, but it's not Avengers, but it is still this like broadly accepted work in like anime communities. It's just, that's one of the things that makes anime special that like you just don't get in other big commercial industries, I think. It's so cool.
Yeah. But I also do hope that, because, you know, obviously, like, it's very well respected, but it's certainly not as watched as, like, the Fate stuff is, because this doesn't have, like, you know, Fate Grand Order. I mean, you get, like, the little spin-off, the little, like, extra event that they did in Fate Grand Order, but generally speaking, you know, this is nowhere near to the level of popularity that the Fate series is. So I do hope that if there are people, you know, who were looking forward to us talk about Fate, that this was served as like a way for them to get into this series as well, because it's not as fully watched, but it is just as good and certainly deserves to be watched. And anybody who enjoys the Fate series, I'm sure, has loved watching Garden of Sinners. So I hope, you know, our fans looking forward to us talk about Fate enjoyed, if you hadn't yet gone through this journey, going through the journey of Garden of Sinners with us also, because this show, it is so worth like going back and really appreciating how good this was.
And it's more accessible than ever now, which is nice.
Yes.
Because even when we were just gaming this season out, I don't think it was on Crunchyroll yet. So It's been cool to see it go up. And even if Singing in the Rain is missing from those couple of episodes, it's out there and it's easy to find, and it's got all the fun openings, and, you know, it's so cool.
Yes, and they have it all in the right order, so it's like, you know, that's also with this series is so you're like, oh god, is someone going to look up the chronological order on Wikipedia and try to fuck with it? You know, it's like, no, it's all laid out properly in production order with the epilogue and everything in there. Yeah, it is awesome that this is so accessible, because again, when I originally watched these, it was not easy to get access to a lot of this stuff. And you definitely had to go on the you know, find the dark corners of the internet to watch something like the epilogue. It's like, that was a pain in the ass to try to fucking find for this thing. I remember when I originally watched this, so.
Yes. So 2 thumbs up for Karano Kyokai. One of those thumbs then cut off by Shiki's cool knife. But we still love it.
Yeah, still love it, absolutely. But we have new pastures to turn to.
Yes,
Jonathan.
we do. You should tell the people what we're doing next week, Sean.
Yes, so next week we are having a special episode, I guess, of this podcast, where we are going to do our history lesson on Fate, the Fate Stay Night, Fate Zero, what the fuck is all this stuff? What is a visual novel? What the fuck is going on? You know, this is one of the things about Fate that is a little bit frustrating in trying to recommend it to people and stuff, is that it is one of those adaptations that is weird to try to explain because there's all these weird spin-offs and it's an adaptation of this visual novel that has 3 roots and all that kind of stuff. So we'll talk about that. And then also, I'm extremely excited to talk about the first episode, the premiere of Fate Zero, which we'll just be talking about the first episode next time. The episode after that will be the full Fate Zero episode. But I thought it was really important, and I need to, like, catch you, Jonathan, in the process at least once. I want to know, what is the experience of watching Fate Zero as your introduction into the world of Fate? And so we'll get to talk about that, something I'm extremely excited to do.
Japanimation Station. 「優しい時間との時間